Welcome to the CEC Report for July 25th. I'm Elisa Barwick and with me is CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Elisa.
On the program today we'll be discussing three topics. Detroit, test case for genocide. G20 ramps up drive for Bailin, and from boat people to royal babies. Who needs them? Now firstly, Detroit test case for genocide. Now on this program we've been discussing the fact that we're facing in the immediate period ahead the next phase of the global financial meltdown, which will completely destroy the entire global financial system, and the fact that as a consequence there is a global policy drive to put the banks ahead of the people, to protect the banks, even if that means the people going by the wayside. Now, in the United States, there is a test case for this underway, which is the city of Detroit. And that city filed for bankruptcy on the 18th of July. It's the largest municipal bankruptcy in United States history. They've been bankrupt for some time. In fact, they've had financial crisis management boards in place for over 4 years now. But basically, like we've seen in the case in Australia with many of our local shire councils and churches and hospitals and so forth that lost money during the GFC, Detroit was suckered into investing into a lot of derivative swap deals and so forth, which in turn were rigged by the LIBOR rigging scandal. They lost money when interest rates changed and so forth. So they were basically fleeced. And they're now at the point where they've got no alternative but to declare bankruptcy. But as part of those bankruptcy arrangements, basically the pensioners will not be paid their pensions. They might end up seeing pennies on the dollar, whereas there have been separate deals made whereby the banks and the swap dealers will be paid anywhere from 70 to 80% of what they're owed. So what I wanted to ask you, Craig, is this the bail-in that we've been talking about really occurring by stealth here?
Yes, it is, Elisa. Let me explain what bail-in is, because it's a term that Australian media don't talk about. It's something that we've come across. Bail-in is the means it's actually done by banks and by regulatory authorities to say that banks and some other institutions have the right to take the deposits that are in the bank, freeze them and convert them to shares. Right, that's what the bail-in actually is.
But so shares in the worthless bank.
Shares in the worthless bank. And what you've seen in Cyprus is the model for the world. And you know, some people, there's this myth that a certain amount of deposits are protected, and then the rest of these are unprotected deposits, or uninsured deposits they call them. Well, in the case of Cyprus, those uninsured deposits will be are worthless. In fact, in some of the banks they've been written off. But the point is, Elisa, is that the intention here is to save these banks, to save the financial stability of the system by putting people last. So in the case of ordinary depositors, right, the people have got their money in their bank, pensions and so forth, you know, the point is that the banks want to have the right to take every last cent and give to preserve themselves. Well, look at what's happening in Detroit. You have now the banks are saying we have to be paid at all cost, and the deposits in the municipal system, or in the local councils, for example, which take the different form. They take the form of good health care, emergency services, ambulances, firefighters, that sort of thing, basically are being stripped and cut down. So when you get a situation where a house catches on fire, a derelict house, then the fire brigade, there isn't a fire brigade capability to put that fire out, so good houses burn down as well. That's, in a sense, stealing the deposits of generations of people into their local councils from those people. It takes the form of the banks having to be propped up.
And it really is fascism, which is not just us saying this, but in fact a former state legislator, Lamar Lemons, who's now the Detroit School Board president, has stated this unequivocally, that this is fascism. There have been, by the Michigan state judge, rulings that this is unconstitutional, that you cannot actually just steal the people's pensions and stop making all these payments. But We're going to watch a segment. We'll play to you a 6-minute segment from a LPAC TV video where Lamar Lemons will talk about exactly what's going on so you can see for yourself.
Detroit has been in a depression for decades now. The country may have been in a recession, but Detroit has been in depression. The banks have plundered and pillaged. They're making millions of dollars off the misery of the city of Detroit, and they are being paid while they threaten the pensioners. We have about a 50% unemployment rate in the city of Detroit in real terms. 50%. That means every other Detroiter you see is unemployed and seeking and wishing to have work, even if they stop looking. We've closed literally over the last few years 200 schools. 200 schools, decimating neighborhoods. It is also, with the services for the city, the EMS trucks often are overextended and people wait hours to be serviced from an emergency. And it's almost always better to rush to the hospital yourself than to wait for an EMS truck. Fires go on and spread from unoccupied homes, catching fire on occupied homes, and further destroying neighborhoods because of archaic and non-functioning equipment and the lack of trucks and firemen able to put out the fires. The police response time is literally in the hours instead of the minutes. The street lights are out in almost 50% of the city. Crime flourishes, desperation expounds, and the misery index probably eclipses most places in the United States and in some cases on the planet Earth. We're the capital in the world of abandoned homes and properties. There are more abandoned buildings in the city of Detroit than anywhere else in the world. Well, you know, if Mr. LaRouche chose, he could say, "I told you so." He predicted the current economic collapse. And if we don't heed those words, we are facing some extremely dire times. I don't know if the ship can be turned around, but they certainly can't if we don't reinstate the GlassSteagall, if we don't put in a works program similar to what Mr. LaRouche has called for and to what Franklin Delano Roosevelt instituted. We must build infrastructure. It is now archaic. Much of it is still part of the 19th and 20th century, and we must move on for the 21st and prepare for the 22nd century. We must expand and develop the infrastructure and create jobs, and thereby increasing the standard of living for all Americans.
Detroit, once the great industrial engine of the nation, has experienced a decades-long population collapse of truly genocidal proportions. A city originally built on mass production, with the highest concentration of skilled productive labor in the nation, has been the victim of an increasingly accelerating breakdown crisis over the past more than 60 years, almost 3 generations. The population of Detroit began to explode around the turn of the 20th century, increasing exponentially around 1910. However, with the crash of 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression, the population of Detroit began to level off and even decline for the first time in its history. It wasn't until Franklin Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy that the population began to grow again, surging to its maximum in 1950 with a population of over 1.8 million people, making Detroit the 5th largest city in the United States at the time. However, after 1950, the population began to drop once again, slowly at first, but accelerating over time. By the year 2000, the population had collapsed to under 1 million, and by 2010 to 713,000, less than the population was a century before, a more than 60% drop from its peak in 1950, a loss of over 1 million people. This genocide will only continue to accelerate at an ever-increasing rate under the bankers' dictatorship now controlling the city.
The fascist state is here in Detroit in that we don't have democracy. We vote for a mayor who has no power. We vote for a council who has no power. And yes, we vote for a school board who has no power. And we've been in waiting, and this was supposed to be an emergency. But what we find is that once the dictators come in, they don't leave. We've had, for the last 4.5 consecutive years, we've had an emergency manager or / emergency financial manager for the Detroit Public Schools. We're concerned about the loss of democratic rights here in the city of Detroit. We're speaking about Kevin Orr right now in the city of Detroit. He became initially a emergency financial manager, which limited him to just being over the finances of the city. And they then grandfathered the city of Detroit in for an emergency manager, which has complete control under Public Act 436, complete control over the assets and the lives of the citizens of the city of Detroit. He is, in effect, a dictator. We, in the city of Detroit, we have a fascist state.
So it's a pretty shocking state of affairs in Detroit, pretty chilling actually. But isn't it the case, Craig, that the policies that put Detroit in this situation are exactly the same policies Australia has followed, and this is what we're soon going to be facing if we don't change policy now?
The policy that has to be brought in, Elisa, is what we've been campaigning for internationally, and we need a GlassSteagall. We need to cut this payment to these speculative banks. Get rid of that, right? Bring back GlassSteagall. We need to re-regulate the banking system, split off the good part of the banks, preserve the commercial banking system, but get rid of the speculative merchant banking aspects of it, which is where all the speculation takes place. And that's really what we're faced here, because if we don't, we're gonna head the same way as Detroit. In fact, we're already heading that way now. I mean, you only have to look at the amount of homelessness in this country, which is hidden mostly, the amount of housing affordability, where people can't get cheap rents anymore. I mean, it means that you're looking at the same thing, but this is what took place in Detroit several years back, which is it's slowly catching up here in Australia. Yeah,
and so many of our shire councils are completely bankrupt as well, and they have lost money in the same way.
Well, what's really stark is the way that you're looking at a banker's dictatorship over elected bodies. And as Lamar said, the school board hasn't got any power, the councils haven't got any powers.
Exactly.
The state government hasn't got any powers. Why not? It's because they've got a dictator in the United States. His name is Barack Obama, who's bailed out the banks. So therefore, without a GlassSteagall, without getting rid of Obama and getting a GlassSteagall, there is no other option to look at this as a genocidalist policy. And that, unfortunately, is what the global policy is presently. And we're very much part of the British Empire, and those particular policies are at the forefront of the upcoming G20 meetings. They're at the forefront of our role with the Financial Stability Board, which is part of the Bank of International Settlements. We play a key role in this. So any idea that people don't think that this sort of policy that's in Detroit is not coming to Australia is completely out of this world.
And you've got to come at it from a standpoint of principle, and that is from the CEC standpoint that you have to put the people ahead of the banks. So you can scrap the banks, you can scrap a whole lot of the derivatives, but the people and policies for the survival and the future of the people have to come first. So we've run out of time for this segment, but we'll be right back after this short break. Welcome back to the CEC Report. G20 drive for Bailin ramps up. So we've just been talking about the new policy of Bailin, Craig. Now the G20 summit is coming up in St. Petersburg in Russia from September 5th to 6th. Now we don't know when the election's going to be called, but one thing we know for sure is that Rudd will want to be at that G20 meeting if he possibly can. His history in this matter was that at the G20 in London in 2009, Rudd was a key guy in pushing that the G20 be the body that would deal with the global financial meltdown, and Australia at that summit signed on to the creation of the Financial Stability Board, which was designed to implement the bail-in policy where people would be made to pay for the massive losses, derivative losses and other losses of the banks. Now, what we already know is being built up at this G20 summit comes from the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting, which already took place in Moscow from July 19th to 20th. And the communique that was signed by those finance ministers and central bank governors stated that we strongly support the work to establish robust resolution regimes and resolution plans consistent with the scope and substance of the Financial Stability Board's key attributes of effective resolution for any financial institution that could be systemically important beyond the banking sector. It went on to say, we will undertake any legislative and other steps needed to enable authorities to resolve financial institutions in an effective manner, including in a cross-border context.
Mm-hmm.
So Australia's signed on to this because we're a member, we were there, and we're committing ourselves by that statement to bring in legislation required for the FSB's key attributes, which is bail-in, is it not?
The Financial Stability Board, which was created under Kevin Rudd, established this thing called resolution regime. And they have a series of points that are called key attributes.
Right.
Now, number 3 of that is the need for banks to be able to convert their unsecured creditors, aka depositors, into shares. That's the 3rd resolution. Now, this is a very, very, very delicate issue, and there's been warnings from the IMF not to talk about how this would be done and so forth. And the intention is basically to steal deposits.
Yeah.
Now, we've gone through the history of the Bank of International Settlements. This is the bank that was actually facilitated Hitler coming to power. It was created out of the Versailles Treaty, where you had this terrible war reparations placed on Germany. It was the bank that coordinated all those payments, and out of this pops the FSB, and the intention is characteristic of what this sort of bank is, to steal people's deposits, to impose the sort of austerity that's come from Greece and what we've seen in Cyprus. And this bail-in model or the Cyprus model, is what is being pushed. Now, this is what we are moving into in Moscow, where this has been discussed amongst the Finance Committee members. Next year in November, Australia hosts the G20 down here. So we're playing a crucial role, Elisa, in facilitating, as we would as part of the empire, the policies of genocide that the British Crown wants us to push through these sorts of institutions. And our problem is that people have this illusion, they won't do this to us. Unfortunately, the history of Australia has always been that we have taken our lead from the City of London, and it's only when you get courageous people stand up like John Curtin, Ben Chifley, Ted Theodore, Jack Lang, and fight against what they referred to as the money power, right, which is the City of London, that you actually get any changes of policies that support the nation state. Now, we have a rich history of this in our publications. We talk about this all the time, but we're up against the money power par excellence in terms of the Financial Stability Board. And it's for the reason why we're moving into a massive mobilisation on defeating the bail-in for the country.
Yeah.
It's coming here. They've told us there's legislation in train for Australia. We haven't found that yet, but we know it's being written.
And it's committed to in this G20 statement issued in Moscow.
It's been confirmed that they're going to do this.
Exactly.
And one interesting thing is that various members of Parliament and other officials have said how easy it was to get the legislation through in 2008 under periods of crisis. We're going to have GFC Mark II. There's going to be another crisis, and at that particular point of time, it's very dangerous that we can see this sort of legislation allowing people's deposits to be stolen to be pushed through.
And it's most crucial that people mobilise and that we hammer our politicians about this now, because it's not long in the scheme of things that we can reach a point, as we've just seen with the example of Detroit, where even the legislators themselves have the power taken out of their hands to make those decisions or to block these kind of decisions. So call your MP, go to our bail-in page and our website for more information. We'll be back right after this break. welcome back to the CEC Report. Now finally, from boat people to royal babies, who needs them? Now you're not going to get another whole segment on what Kate wore or the royal baby's name. We wanted to point out that there were 370,000 babies born on July 22nd. It wasn't only Prince George Alexander Louis of Cambridge. And in fact, it's quite an irony because Prince Philip, the great-grandfather? He's the great-grandfather of this baby, hates people, and he believes there should be nowhere near that many new babies born. In fact, he's often said that he would like to be reincarnated as a deadly virus. Now, one of the other ironies is that, and this was pointed out by a fellow by the name of Jorgen Randers, who's famous for writing the Limits to Growth book recently in an April interview with Corriere della Sera, where he said that a child in an industrialised country on average consumes 40 to 60 times more resources and energy than a child born in India.
So a royal baby would consume 4,000 to 6,000 times more energy when you think about what goes into the royal family.
Exactly. So if you're going to start to talk about which babies should and shouldn't be born, if you're going to limit population growth, really you shouldn't be talking about the ones born in India and Africa and so forth. You should be talking about these.
But that's typical of the hypocrisy here, because these people see themselves as royalty, completely over and above the ordinary human being. And
Exactly.
this is a mindset.
The oligarchical mindset. And this Jorgen Randers went on in this article to point out, he praised Italy for having the lowest birth rate in the world, not by choice was the key thing, but because he said in the last 20 years we've created a society that's made it totally impossible for a woman to have both a job and a child. So he said the Italians made the right choice because they're only having on average 1.4 children per household.
See, I think, Elisa, the point here is that this policy of depopulation is a key policy of the royal family. It's a key policy of the British Empire. And we see this, we have this irony where we have the birth of a royal child, but we also have this horrendous commentary, this horrendous policy being put in place today with the boat people. And you see the conditions on Nauru and Manus Islands, which is basically slavery. And people have to, a lot of people believe this as being a good policy. If they pick up our paper, Defeat the British Empire of Monetarism, which we published back in 2009, and they read about the true history of our country, what we're creating on Manus Island and Nauru is exactly the same conditions in 1788 to 1800s or so, when we transported convicts out. Well, we didn't, but the British transported convicts out to Australia.
A mini penal colony.
They intended in those penal colonies to create conditions so horrendous that Australia wouldn't become seen as another America, a beacon of hope, temple of liberty, and that sort of thing. The intention was to create horrendous conditions, which they succeeded in doing through the sorts of transportation of mass transportation at that time. So what we're looking at when we look at Manus Island and Nauru is the exact same policy that we had over 200 years in this country. And people are saying this is a good policy. They are being completely idiotic when it comes to looking at what this policy is. And it's completely unnecessary. We're an empty country and we need to develop ourselves.
Exactly, but we have this anti-population bent, which is that oligarchical Prince Philip notion. And people are dying, in these boats. We should be helping to stop the circumstances under which that's coming about worldwide with global development. Now that's all we've got time for today. Thanks for tuning in to the CEC Report, and join us again next week.